Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Russia is continuing its genocidal war against Ukraine for the third year in a row, and at the same time it sells or tries to sell the idea of Ukraine and Russia are brotherly nations in Russia and abroad. What stays behind this idea and this narrative, and why this narrative is so important for understanding this war? To discuss this, we have invited Professor Maria Popova, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University. Welcome, Professor Popova.
Hello, good to be here.
Thank you that you have found time for this conversation. And once again, Russia has changed their narratives and their explanation why they started this war, which we know is a war of genocide and absolutely unjustified aggression. But the attempts to explain and to sell this were quite different and included practically everything what one can imagine. And one of these narratives was that there is no war at all because it cannot be war among brothers. Uh, how is it possible that someone comes to this idea at all to sell this strange narrative? What is behind it?
Well, what's behind it is a long-standing conceptualization of the Russian nation as consisting of three groups: the Russians, the Belarusians, and the Ukrainians, and with the Belarusians and the Ukrainians as these little brothers that are nonetheless still part of the greater Russian nation. So that's why they can make this argument that Russians and Ukrainians are eternally linked together, and it is unnatural for them to be apart. Now, this kind of conceptualization of the Russian nation is not the only conceptualization of the Russian nation. Certainly, there could have been a way to imagine the Russian nation as being a nation state content to be within its borders, defined like other nations define their themselves through the borders of the state that they inhabit. This was sort of an option that was available to Russia in the early 90s when it gained independence from the collapse of the Soviet Union, but was an identity conception that was not developed. It was not pursued further, and it did not take root. Instead, they went back to this idea that Ukrainians belong to them.
And we can say also that this idea is not something what Vladimir Putin or his ideologists have invented. It was presented during the Soviet Union time and even earlier during the Tsarist time, as they didn't use even the word Ukrainians in official terminology. They called Ukrainians smaller Russians. And that was this idea, okay, they don't have even their own sovereignty, etc. And it was combined, of course, with the ban on language, with the ban on education in Ukrainian language, ban on printing books, etc. So this concept is not new. But can we say that there is something what differs in the modern Russian ideology regarding Ukraine compared with the Soviet or with the Tsarist ideology? I personally can address the idea that Ukrainian nation, as Putin says, was artificially created and has never existed before. To this idea, neither the communists nor the Tsars have come, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long-standing idea, this idea that the three nations belong together in this one civilization. That is absolutely a very long-standing idea through the centuries, not Putin's invention. But you're right that under Putin right now, we have this, it's taken up a notch. It's taken up a notch to the point where the very idea of a separate Ukrainian nation, of Ukrainianness, is now perceived and conceptualized as anti-Russianness. sort of the epitome of the anti-Russia is being Ukrainian, and that's why, as you mentioned, this becomes a genocidal war, because the goal is to root out Ukrainianness as Ukrainians understand it, live it, and define it.
And that is exactly what we witness now when we read the Telegram channels of Russian units, when we watch the interviews with the Russian soldiers made by Russian TV channels. We see this narrative that their goal is to, as they say, to save those people in Ukraine from being Ukrainians and bring them back to normality, as they say, to explain them that they're Russians, and those who are not ready to accept this idea, they should be eliminated. That is what Russian RIA Novosti agency published in the first week of the full-scale invasion in the program article, What Should Be Done with Ukraine. And that is absolutely new. But let me ask you, do the Russians accept this idea from your point of view? And why did Putin and his generals and his ideologists, why did they need to go that far? Because before, for 300 years, Russia didn't need this concept that Ukraine does not exist.
There's two separate questions here. I guess one is that this question of whether the Russian population at large buys into this idea. I think they're amenable to it, given that this has become the narrative that the state is producing right now. There's not a lot of pushback against it. It's a little bit of a nuance to go from well, this is a nation that belongs to us in this unity of three nations together in one civilization, to saying, well, they never existed, someone else invented them as separate. It's a bit of a nuanced position to really for the ordinary Russian to really think through, but there is no sign that this kind of escalation of the narrative is creating problems for the regime with the Russian population. I mean, they're open to this idea, and it's peddled by the regime and by the state. So in general, they're going with it. And I wanted to also point out that it's become really a common thread, not occasionally brought up, but in fact very often brought up by all sorts of representatives of the Russian state. It's not even only journalists, but it's also people in decision-making positions, also the church. Priests repeatedly from the Russian Orthodox Church say things like, we need to exorcise the Ukrainianness out of Ukrainians. It is this special operation is like surgery on a sick patient, and the goal is to excise the disease, which in this case they perceive and conceptualize the disease as Ukrainianness itself. So it is really a project to eliminate the Ukrainian nation.
And of course, I remember how even before the full-scale invasion, Maria Zakharova, press secretary of Russian Foreign Ministry, accused Ukraine of imposing Ukrainianness in Ukrainian schools, as if it is something strange that Ukrainian schools teach people and pupils about Ukraine. But for Russian Foreign Ministry, it was already a sort of a crime. Um, Before we go further, I would like to remind the audience to like, to share, and to subscribe to this channel, and to send a link to this interview to people who you believe needs to listen to the insights of how this perception of Ukraine works in Russian society for centuries, and what does it mean for Russia now. What I wanted to ask you further, of course, these genocidal ideas which are being spread among large part of Russian population, and of course supported and uh, injected into the society by the elites, they are not what those who belong to Russian liberal opposition abroad share. But still, when we observe the discussion between the Russian liberal opposition abroad and the Ukrainians, we see that, first of all, Ukrainians are quite not happy with the narratives which are being spread by the Russian liberal oppositions, and B, Russian liberal opposition tends to either miss the topic of Ukraine at all in their rhetorics, or to address it in a way that says, okay, the Ukrainians are suffering, yes, but the Russians are suffering much more because Russians are suffer from the regime and from Ukrainian bombs and from the Western sanctions, etc. So, what is the image of Ukraine in the eyes of the Russian liberal opposition in the West? And
Mm.
how can one describe it? Is it also a sort of a version of an imperial view, or is it something else?
Well, the Russian opposition that's in the West right now is in this position where if they would like to broaden their appeal in Russian society, which is now quite limited, if they would like to broaden it, it dictates to them that they cannot be too pro-Ukrainian because the war that the Putin regime is waging is not particularly unpopular with the Russian population. So if you like to broaden your appeal, you can't be very vigorously attacking something that is, somewhat acceptable and not seen as the main problem. So I think that's why they're staying away from these topics, partly because they would like to broaden their appeal, which is very limited right now.
You, if I may interrupt you here, that is what Yulia Navalny, for example, fiercely denied in her recent interview to German media. She said quite the opposite, that the broad Russian audience is against this war, and that this war is only Putin's war, not only in the sense that he commands this war, but in the sense that almost nobody in Russia supports this war. They're just afraid of saying that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to have an evidence-based debate about this. I think maybe she wants to believe that, but it's not easy to actually show good evidence that Russian society is in fact not supportive or actively opposed to this war. And because of that uncertainty, and because they would like to have a broader appeal, they have to focus only on Russia. But the problem with that, we may understand where their strategy comes from, but the problem is that they then become not really useful to ending this war because they basically cannot fully push for ending it. They can't push for arming Ukraine better. They can't even bring themselves to say that Ukraine should be armed by its allies in the first place. But even then, they can't push for better arms for Ukraine. They can't push for stronger sanctions for Russia. They're in fact trying to advocate for weaker sanctions. So, in effect, all that remains is their sort of performative opposition to the war. But in reality, they can't push for anything that would, in effect, help to end the war. And it's a difficult kind of situation. And I think it's because we might understand why they're doing that. That's a separate question from, well, given that the focus right now should be trying to find ways to end the war and to help Ukraine defeat this aggression. Is there any benefit of engaging with the Russian opposition right now? The Russian opposition that's in the West, I don't see much benefit from it. They can't. We might understand why they can't help, but the point is they cannot help right now. So there's no reason to engage with them.
Indeed, we have seen recently the calls spread by Ilya Yashin, Yulia Navalny, and Vladimir Karamurza for a large Russian anti-war demonstration in Berlin. And this call has already raised a lot of questions. First, all the videos calling for this demonstration use a lot of Russian official flags, which triggers many people who live in Berlin and have escaped Russia's war of aggression when the Russian troops came under the same Russian flags. But that's the first part. The second part is that the demands of this rally are to pull back Russian troops from Ukraine, to release political prisoners, and to try Vladimir Putin. And then I started asking, okay, who is the person or a group you address your demands to pull back the troops and to release political prisoners? It's Vladimir Putin. And you cannot demonstrate in Berlin demanding something from Vladimir Putin. It makes no sense. And the third thing is to trial Vladimir Putin. For that, Russia must be defeated and Putin must be arrested. But you don't call for
Right. I
weapons for
mean,
Ukraine.
I think it's a tough situation, and I'm sure the answer from them will be that people want them to show a clear anti-war position. If they're doing this through a demonstration, that's good to be welcome. But I agree that it is not clear what the course of action that can be useful from this really is. It seems to me that if they would like to make a difference and hasten the downfall of the Putin regime, they really need to be advocating with Western governments to arm Ukraine better, to roll back the escalation management approach, to especially since they're based, a lot of them in Germany, and potentially have channels of communication with the German government. The goal should be to press the German government to provide more aid and to dispel the notion that it would be possible to negotiate with Putin, and somehow if escalation doesn't happen on the Western side, this would lead to de-escalation on Putin's side. They could be useful in convincing the German government that this is not the right approach. I mean, I did see Navalny mention that negotiations with Putin are detrimental and will not be productive. That's a good start, but it's also important to then say, well, if we cannot negotiate and it's not a good idea, what else is there to be done? Clearly, it should be arming Ukraine better, and so it's disappointing that she didn't make that extra step.
Absolutely. And if Chancellor Scholz doesn't believe the Ukrainians that Ukraine must be armed better, he should have believed the Russian opposition. But the Russian opposition is obviously silent on this case and never called, for example, for Taurus for Ukraine. I would love to see a demonstration of Russian opposition leaders in front of the Office of Federal Chancellor demanding Taurus for Ukraine. That would have disarm all opponents of this idea, but the Russian opposition has never done it yet.
Yeah, I wanted to add, sorry, because while we're still on this topic, one thing that I have been suggesting for a long time now is that if the Russian opposition wants to be really useful, one thing that they can do is to advocate for Ukraine to be given an invitation to join NATO, and to actually clearly state, as someone who, as people who intend or have the ambition to rule Russia at some point after Putin, we state that Ukraine belongs in NATO. It has the right to do that. It is our position as potentially future government of Russia that this should happen. I don't think I've seen them push this point, but I think it would be useful to really draw a clear line between Putin's Russia and what they perceive and argue will be a better Russia, a Russia that is going to respect the sovereignty of its neighbors, and it's going to allow them to have whatever foreign policy choices they domestically decide. So it would be a good signal for the Russian opposition to state very clearly that they support Ukraine in NATO. But it's something that I don't think I've seen.
Do you think that it's realistic? Because if we look at for example, the decolonization agenda, we see that the leaders of Russian opposition, who are mostly people from Moscow and who are mostly ethnically Russians, they cannot stand the mentioning of decolonization discourse and call against this discourse, saying that it's harmful, denying practically the right of indigenous nations who has been colonized by first the Muscovy Tsardom and then by the empire, deny their right for self-determination. And we see it in Navalny, in Yashin. We see it. The only person who says that it is okay and it should be done if the nations want it to have is Garry Kasparov. And all others, including Mikhail Khodorkovsky and others, are vehemently against the right of nations who has been colonized by Russia to create their future. So this imperial character is still there, not only about Ukraine, but also about the Bashkirs, the Tatars, or the Buryats, or the others.
Empires are indeed hard and durable things. It's very hard to start sort of decolonizing your attitudes first. I think I've seen some tentative moves in that direction by Yashin too. But you're right that there's a long way to go. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that these are really two, to a large extent, two separate questions, both important, but it's especially important to emphasize that Ukraine is already an independent state recognized by the entire international community. So the imperial claims on Ukraine are extremely anachronistic and absolutely in violation of all international law. So they really, that's a hard stop, I think. And part of showing that Russia truly recognizes, a new Russia will truly recognize Ukraine's sovereignty, has to do with lifting any Russian objections on Ukraine's NATO membership.
And when we talk about this perception of Russia, it's not only perception from within, it's also perception from outside. And I can remember that in Berlin, when I talked to politicians before the full-scale invasion, and we discussed the topic of, for example, sanctions on Russia, etc. And many politicians said, "Oh, we cannot go very harsh on Russia because Russia is our neighbor." And according to any geographic map, Russia is not a neighbor of Germany. And it's maybe neighbor of Poland in the region of Kaliningrad. There is small border between Poland and Russia, but not Germany, under no circumstances. Russia used to be neighbor of Germany in 1939, but it's long before and only after Berlin and Moscow have occupied many countries of Central Europe. So, from the German perspective, still, before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine practically didn't exist, as didn't exist many other nations. But Russia existed in its full greatness and imperial character. So, what do you think? Has this view changed? As up to now, the security interests of Russia are still something what impacts the decision making in the Western capitals. And while we talk very clearly that Ukraine may not be defeated in this war, many politicians in the West accept that Ukraine loses part of its territory, but none of them, as a victim of the aggression, but none of them can even imagine that Russia loses, for example, a part of its territory or can be defeated.
Yeah, indeed. I think the deep-seated assumption that Russia is too big and too powerful to lose this war is there in Western capitals, very deeply ingrained and very, very hard to change. It's a much longer time horizon, so to speak. All these Western decision makers have believed for a very long time that Russia is a world superpower, and superpowers don't lose. And so, even though Ukraine has made some inroads, it looked like Ukraine managed to advocate for itself really effectively. And indeed, Western capitals went from expecting Kyiv to fall in 3 days to now seeing that, and in some ways maybe becoming a bit too complacent, that Ukraine can hold off Russian aggression forever. Um, but I think this is a very surface level change. Um, Deep down, the idea is that Russia is here to stay and will somehow need to be accommodated. There has not been a shift towards the idea that Russia needs to be defeated in this aggressive war in a similar way in which Nazi Germany was defeated. We're nowhere near such a position or such a consensus among Western decision makers. It increasingly seems like they're not even willing to embrace the idea that Russia has lost Ukraine. It has lost the opportunity to impose its preferences and its dominance on Ukraine. I thought for a while that the West had understood that we're past this moment, that Russia cannot regain Ukraine. I'm I'm now starting to have doubts that they truly have internalized this idea. I think there is still some understanding in the West that this unfortunate war will be over, and Ukraine will somehow continue to be some sort of buffer and some sort of gray zone in between the West and Russia. Whereas it really should have been it should have become very clear to the West, I think, that this is not a sustainable position, that Russia does not accept gray zones. It accepts zones that it dominates, like the Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe between in the second half of the 20th century, or it doesn't have any influence, like Russia cannot now influence the Eastern European countries that are in NATO and in the EU. So there should be an understanding that Ukraine will either be dominated by Russia, and if that happens, it is will be partly due to betrayal by the Western allies, or it will have to be firmly anchored in the West. There's no other way for this war to be solved.
Absolutely, and we can see what happens to the countries which have not got Western support and some sort of integration into the Western defensive and security mechanisms, like Belarus, which is occupied and practically annexed by Russia, or the countries of the South Caucasus, like Georgia, which is partly occupied by Russia, partly undermined by Russian influence. And we see what is happening now in Georgia, where people go to the streets to protest and got beaten by the police, which serves the Russia-controlled regime. So there is like no way in between. There is no such thing as neutrality, as many Western politicians dream for Ukraine, without knowing how to make this neutrality works. And what is important, most of Ukrainians don't want neutrality because they know that proclaimed neutrality is the one-way road to hell. That when we focus now on this perception of from abroad of Russia, what can we say about the development of Russia's image in Ukraine? We can remember that before the first invasion of 2014, many Ukrainians, majority of Ukrainians, had a positive view on Russia, or at least neutral view of Russia, which has changed first in 2014 after the occupation of Crimea, and dramatically changed after the full-scale invasion. Uh, so these changes seem to be irreversible out of very sad reasons. Sad not that they're irreversible, but sad as things like Bucha and Mariupol and other things should have happened for that. But how can we describe the way of development of Russia's image in Ukraine, as Russia has invested obviously a lot to subjugate Ukrainian mentality?
Absolutely. Basically, what we observe, and this is a process that Oksana Shevel and I talk about in our book at length, is that we observe a gradual divergence between Russia and Ukraine, that Russian policy only sustains, fuels, and exacerbates over time. And so what we see, as you mentioned, after 2014, we see a significant shift. This is, in fact, that's the moment in which a majority of Ukrainians decide that they will have to go west. It happens only in 2014 that Ukraine's geopolitical orientation truly starts to shift, which is, by the way, one of the ways in which it's very clear that the whole idea that Russia invaded Ukraine because of its desire for NATO fails immediately when you think and when you understand that, in fact, the change in Ukraine's geopolitical orientation happens only after it's already invaded by Russia. So it cannot be the cause of the invasion if it is actually the result of it. So after 2014, though, we actually have some data in the book that shows that Ukrainians actually maintain of them at least maintain this idea that they will be able to live with Russia as a separate country, but somehow a friendly country, that they will have to be able, that they will be able to come up with some sort of arrangement in which the two countries can exist as separate independent entities but not be enemies. It's after 22 that this illusion is dispelled completely, and we see the complete rupture between Russia and Ukraine. And for obvious reasons, now the vast majority of Ukrainians know that they cannot be on friendly terms with Russia, because Russia just does not offer friendly terms. For Russia, the word friendly is, in fact, a euphemism for domination. When they say we want this country to be friendly, it really implies we want this country to be subordinated to us and loyal and do as we demand. That's how the Eastern European countries of the Warsaw Pact were friendly countries to the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century. They were dominated. So Ukrainians have now fully understood this this situation, and we have now Ukrainian public opinion firmly on the side of just simply cutting ties with Russia and protecting their country from Russia, rather than pursuing any sort of cooperation or friendly relationship. That illusion is gone.
That is, I guess, what Russians try to put the seeds into the minds of all nations, which they try to subjugate and colonize, to create this cover of friendliness, which indeed meant subjugation. And that reminds me how the Russians use the word fascist or a Nazi. They call a fascist or a Nazi any nation which just wants to have their sovereign and independent policy. And as long as it's not in harmony with with Russia's orders, the nation immediately turns to a Nazi. That's how Ukrainian Jewish President Zelensky turned to a Nazi in Russia's rhetorics, because he suddenly was not Russia's friend anymore, and said, "Okay, like now you're the Nazi." And but this is what we could also observe in other nations where Russian dominance came through installations of the monuments to Russian writers, to Russian poets, renaming of the streets, introduction of Russian literature, or even national literature was stored in translations into Russia, didn't it?
Indeed, it's one thing that I think a lot of people in the West don't realize is that when you're in the Russian sphere of influence, that goes way beyond control of your foreign policy. So when in the West, when people hear of the word sphere of influence, they think, well, you know, maybe their foreign policy decisions will be limited a little bit. What's so bad about that? What's so terrible about being neutral? What's so terrible about being told what organizations, in terms of foreign policy, you can join or not? What they don't realize is that being in Russia's sphere of influence means a lot more than that, means a lot more than foreign policy orientation. It actually means constant meddling in your domestic affairs, which should be 100% the purview of domestic politics and domestic government and domestic public opinion, right? But you have indeed meddling by Russia in how countries interpret their own history, how countries teach their own history, how who countries celebrate from their own historical figures and who they shouldn't be celebrating, what kind of holidays they're marking. It is a level of interference that goes way beyond demands on foreign policy. And I think that's something that in the West there isn't enough appreciation for, there isn't enough understanding that that's what sphere of influence means to Russia.
Indeed, and Russia, as you correctly said, accepts either subjects or enemies. You cannot be just a neutral friend which decides on the equal level what to do and what not to do. And in this context, I always remember the Benjamin Netanyahu, who tried to be Putin's friend, but for Putin, he always needed to be his subjugate, and it ended that Israel was the only country among the Western democracies which had to introduce the 9th of May, the Russian version of the Victory Day in World War II, which feed into the Russian narrative of Russia as the only victor against the Nazi Germany. And Israel was the only country which introduced it the 9th of May, not the 8th of May, as it is historically correct and reflects the facts on the ground. But it didn't help Netanyahu, obviously, and Putin has decided that other allies are more important than he, and went full into a cordial alliance with Iran. We know how it looks now. Thank you so much. It was an amazing, insightful dive into the labyrinth of Russia's narratives, which Russia tries to sell on the world diplomatic scene, and of how other nations, Ukraine, but not only other Western nations, see Russia and see all this historical way, which is far from be over, which we are still walking alone. It was Professor Maria Popova, the Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University. Thank you so much for this insightful interview.